Welcome, everybody. Welcome. I'm Matthew Keeley, Director of Youth Law Australia, and I'm delighted to be hosting this important event on the third day of Victorian Law Week 2024. Now, as I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands and of all the lands on which we work. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and to the children, young people, and families with whom we work all across Australia. I'll be our moderator today, and we have a lot to cover in a short time, 1 hour. So much of what would ordinarily be covered in an introduction, you'll instead find in the chat. Today's event is being recorded. So before we get too far into the event, may I check, please, for our online audience, can you hear and see us? It seems you can. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our supporters, without whom this event would not be taking place. Our funders and colleagues at the Fair Work Ombudsman and the Australian Attorney General's Department, and our pro bono supporters at UNSW Law and Justice and Johnson Winter Slattery. JWS have kindly invited us to use this marvellous venue, facilities, and for those attending, some delightful catering. So thank you, JWS, and in particular, Catherine, Sarah, Saja, and Andrew. And thank you to Katya and Richard at Hoogie Training and Media, here today to stream and record our event. We're here today to shine a light on a major but little understood social problem. Our young people, those aged under 25, are experiencing extraordinarily high rates of problems in the workplace, the highest rates of all age cohorts. And these problems are making them sick. Moderate and severe psychological distress is a common consequence of these problems, amongst others. Now, it's my hope today that we're all going to learn something. We're going to learn more about this problem and about some of the people and organisations that are working to prevent and respond to this problem, and that change is definitely needed. What we've previously done, the status quo, our funders, our legal services, and the broader human services sector is simply not enough moving forward. And so to our program today. Firstly, Hugh and Georgina will outline some key findings and insights from volumes 1 and 2 of the Victoria Law Foundation's world-leading Public Understanding of Law survey. Following that, we will hear from them about the VLF's newly published research paper that takes a deep dive into the survey's data, pointing to young people's problems at work and their legal needs. Then we'll hear from Kelly and Kate, both senior lawyers working in employment law practices for young workers. I'll be asking them how their very different practices already use the evidence base to reach vulnerable young workers, and how they envisage that their practices could usefully implement the new findings and insights from the VLF's new paper. Now, I aim for there to be ample time for our panellists to engage in lively discussion with each other, and we'll leave the final 10 minutes or so for questions from you, our audience. Now, to our online audience, we really want to hear from you. We'll turn to your questions first, so please interact with us by using the Q&A function if you want to send a question privately, the chat function to do so publicly, or just use the emojis. We really want to hear what you're thinking and feeling about what you're hearing. And when asking a question, please let us know who you'd like to answer it. And for those attending in person, my colleague Emily will be about with a microphone to handle those questions. So with all that to look forward to and their bios in the chat, it gives me pleasure to introduce and now hand over to the doctors, Hugh McDonald and Georgina Reichner. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the warm welcome. And we're particularly excited about having the opportunity to share our work with you today. We can skip. I just briefly want to introduce the public understanding of law survey, just really briefly say a little bit about what it is and why it's important. So this is a face-to-face probability sample of people in Victoria. This means it's representative of the experience of Victorians. We interviewed over 6,000 people, of whom 639 were young people. The survey examines civil and family areas of law, so it doesn't go into crime. We've released 2 reports to date, one looking at the legal need component, one looking at the legal capability component, and there'll be another report coming shortly looking at both of those things together. Now, the reason this is important is because it provides a unique perspective and view. So we're getting the lived experience of Victorians who are facing potentially justiciable problems. So they're problems where the law might be relevant and might be offered as a solution that they can use for their situation. And we can measure that regardless or irrespective of whether they recognise that as being a legal issue themselves, whether or not they tried to get legal assistance, and whether or not they were involved in a legal process that contributed to the resolution of that problem. So this is really classic, well-established research methods for looking at barriers to justice. So we have an oversight and a sight that no other data source can provide. So we know who's having problems, who isn't. We know who's taking action, who isn't. We know a little bit about what they're doing to try and resolve that problem and what's happened in the end. Another sort of newish part of this study is looking at legal capability. This helps us understand why people behave in the way they do, and we have a particular take on it. So legal capability to us is a multi-dimensional thing. If you think about it, it applies to everybody in the community. We break it down a little bit into separate dimensions that affect how people see the law, whether they use it or not. There's some knowledge aspects, there's some skill aspects, there's some attribute aspects, so attitudes, emotions, psychological state. People have different access to resources. So we look at all of that together to try to understand a little bit more about why people recognise issues as being legal or not, and what they do or don't do about things. Another way to think about this is that you need more than just knowledge. Skills are important, attributes are important. Traditionally, we've tended to think that if we just give people legal information and the right legal information, or if we can just download the knowledge that are in lawyers' heads into other people's heads, they'll act like sensible lawyers and behave accordingly. Well, our survey shows that that's not true and that's not the case, and that there are these other important dimensions to understanding, firstly, how people behave, and then secondly, thinking about what kinds of responses and service responses and interventions are a better fit for people in that situation, and taking into consideration what they actually need.
All right, thanks Hugh. So I'll now try to very briefly deliver some of the high-level findings from our new report as they relate to young people and their employment problems. So as Hugh mentioned, the youngest age group captured in PULS were between 18 and 24 years old, which comprised 638 respondents, or about 11% of the sample population. 42% of young people experienced a legal problem of any kind, but when it came to employment problems, they actually experienced them at the highest rate of all age groups, with 11% experiencing an employment problem in the 2 years prior to the survey. Of those young people who had employment problems, over half were school leavers who had completed year 12, a fifth had completed a bachelor degree or higher, and around a fifth had completed a trade, vocational certificate or diploma. There were more young people working in sales, trades or service jobs compared to older cohorts, and younger people were more likely to be employed on a part-time basis or casually as part of the gig economy. Income level, high levels of mental distress, and low socioeconomic status were statistically significant predictors of employment problems. Thanks, Emily. So the PULS asked respondents whether they had experienced specific employment problems, such as not getting paid or working in dangerous conditions. Young people experienced comparatively elevated rates for most of these problem subtypes. Of those with employment problems, 50% reported experiencing harassment, bullying, victimisation, or mistreatment at work. So that was all asked within the same variable. 24% reported a problem to do with being sacked or threatened with the sack, and 19% had problems relating to pay. And these were not discrete categories, so many young people experienced more than one employment problem, and actually younger people were more likely to experience clusters of employment problems. And in many cases, these problems would interact and compound. So for example, a young person might report an employment problem and lose their job as a result of that problem. At the time of interview, 59% of young people reported that their problem was unresolved. Of those that had an ongoing problem, only 17% thought that the problem might be resolved in future. And of those that had a problem that remained unresolved, 41% reported that the problem persisted, but that they had given up trying to resolve it. Overall, the PULS found that 44% of young people had an unmet legal need, and you can read more about this legal need measure in the report. This increases when we just focus on young people's employment problems, for which 70% had unmet legal need. Thanks, Emily. The PULS findings on legal capability shed light on how young people perceive and navigate the law in Victoria. Young people were generally less cynical in their views of the law and lawyers. For example, trust in lawyers was highest amongst the youngest PULS respondents and tended to decrease with age. Young people were also less likely to harbour negative narratives about the law when questions were posed in the abstract. Now, of course, these are very high-level findings, and we haven't yet gone down further into various demographics where I'm sure trust in lawyers might decrease. However, when it came to specific scenarios that might be applicable to their own lives, younger people were less likely to perceive the law as being relevant. Younger people had slightly less knowledge about their legal rights and lower levels of confidence. While young people scored highly on practical legal literacy, which involved things like filling in forms or understanding the content of forms, they had a slight deficit when it came to digital capability, which measured ability to undertake tasks online, such as uploading your driver's license. Overall, young people had lower capability, but a more positive attitude toward the law. Thanks, Emily. So in general, young people were more likely than older cohorts to handle problems alone or to seek information from family and friends than to seek out legal advice. 14% of young people who had employment problems reported having used legal advice to address those problems. So there are many reasons why this might have been the case. Young people were the age group who were the least likely to identify their problem as a legal problem, so they would not have been seeking out legal solutions for those problems. In addition, young people reported the highest levels of mental distress of any age group in the PULS. Over half, 52%, reported some level of mental distress at the time of interview, and mental distress was shown to increase with experience of employment problems, as we might expect. So 90% of those who had an employment problem identified stress as a direct consequence of that problem. And we also asked young people, why didn't you seek out legal advice for your employment problem? 18% said that the process would have been too stressful. 20% said that doing so would have made no difference to the outcome. And 25% said that they didn't know where to get advice or that they couldn't find advice. And this was at a much higher rate than those in older age groups. So despite more positive attitudes toward law in the abstract, when it comes to the real problems that young people face in their lives, we see that they are unlikely to recognise their problems as legal. They might not necessarily have the confidence to address those problems. They are overwhelmed, they're stressed, and many are in mental distress. And even where they do take steps to find advice, they might find it difficult to do so. We also need to keep in mind that when it comes to employment problems, there is often a power imbalance between the young person and their employer. And that's even before we take into account other demographic factors that would increase that power imbalance. It's hard to take action on employment problems when you're employed casually, you need to pay rent, you might be studying, and you might lose your job if you speak out. And this was borne out in the PULS results as well. So 8% of young people said that they did not seek out advice for their legal problem for fear of retaliation from their employer or their co-worker. Thanks, Emily. So where to from here? Firstly, this data shows that young people enter work not knowing or unsure of their employment rights, with many not realising their employment problems are legal in nature. There is the opportunity for CLE at high school or universities and TAFEs to equip young people with that knowledge as they begin to enter the workplace. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about some of the current CLE work that is being done and what we're seeing out of those programs. This report also reinforces that CLE needs to address confidence. A young person might know their rights, but having the confidence to enforce those rights is another matter. So as an example, West Justice's youth employment program factored in confidence to their post-CLE questions and found young people not only came away with a good understanding of their workplace rights, but also felt prepared to stand up for their rights at work after their CLE session. And this is obviously a really difficult area to tackle. I don't know what the answer is. Maybe CLE sessions throughout high school and at higher education to reinforce those lessons. And we can turn to that in the discussion about how to bolster that confidence in young people. Secondly, more digital signposting between services would assist in guiding young people who are searching online for help with their problems. Making sure that websites are SEO optimized, that legal services are targeting online channels that young people are likely to be in, and communicating that information in a way that is easy for them to understand and relate to. And thirdly, these findings suggest that there is still a need for joined up legal services that can assist young people with a range of problems. Services that take into account young people's capabilities and particularly concerns about stress may help to make independent advice more accessible. So 14% of young people sought out advice from health professionals. So this was advice for their employment problems, suggesting that health justice partnerships are a promising avenue for addressing young people's legal problems. And services that include mental health resources or support would go some way to alleviating the stress that they experience as a result of those problems. So we hope that this research can inform service providers and community orgs who are doing the frontline work in assisting young people with their legal problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgina and Hugh. I have a couple of quick questions for you. There's mention of a high degree of mental distress amongst this age group. Also mentioned was that this group is very likely to have more than one, those that report a problem are very likely to have more than one problem, and indeed that there are clusters of problems that come with this particular group. In volume 1, there's a table, 3.13, which shows that young people have the second highest rate of all age cohorts for 5 or more problems. I guess I've got a question for you. The report talks about a bidirectional relationship between mental health and legal problems. Is the high degree of mental distress in any way possibly related to this clustering and propensity that young people have to have more than one problem? Indeed, they're the second highest group for having 5+ problems in the course of 2 years.
In short, yes. The bidirectional aspect, we know that experience of a legal problem increases your probability of having additional legal problems. So problems can lead to problems, can lead to problems. We know there's a vicious cycle of problem experience. So you can imagine a situation where you have your income interrupted, you've lost your job, or you've lost your hours or you've lost some income. That can lead to things like housing stress. That can then lead to you're struggling to pay your rent, so all the money goes into that, so then you're struggling to pay with other bills, so we can have a spiralling effect. That can then affect somebody's health and ability to work, and consequently they can spiral and lose more income. So it can be a real vicious cycle where it leads to multiple legal problems, multiple legal and related problems, multiple legal and health related problems. So that's, and then the bidirectional aspect is that having experiencing mental distress can interrupt and cause a whole range of problems, which then problems tend to have adverse consequences, and stress being the number one adverse consequence that experiencing a legal problem can have. Interestingly enough, we also know that getting early advice, getting good advice, can make a tremendous difference to alleviating stress. And that's part of the service challenge.
And a fantastic segue as we move to a discussion with our legal practitioners. So Kelly, the Young Workers Centre, where you're the principal solicitor, appears to be very effective in reaching young workers in Victoria, and I believe your caseload is full. So can you tell us, how the Young Workers Centre has achieved this? What structures have you put in place, to reach vulnerable young workers and to reach them at scale?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Look, I think for those who aren't familiar with the Young Workers Centre, we are a one-stop shop for those 30 and under, which means that we have two arms to the Young Workers Centre. The first is the outreach arm, and we have multiple trainers, multiple organisers whose role it is to go into schools, into TAFEs, and to deliver workplace rights sessions. And those modules are approved by WorkSafe, and our team literally go out and talk directly to students and to apprentices. So people who are right at the cusp of, and some people who aren't actually part of the survey. I didn't realise it was from 18. But the other side then of the Young Workers Centre, which is the team that I'm part of, the legal team, is an accredited community legal centre, and we then have the privilege of representing any young people who are willing to stand up for their rights and progress their justiciable problem, which I think is part of the success, to be honest, is about having that dual role. So we're very proactive about educating young people, and we do that, I think, uniquely through a peer-to-peer system. So the folks in our outreach team are young people as well, which means that it's much easier for them to relate to who they're speaking to, and much easier for those people to relate to listen and understand, because young people do have a different language, and I don't know what it is. But where our value comes in as lawyers is to be able to try and bridge that gap. And I think even, one of the things, sorry, I'm flowing into discussion, but I can't help myself. One of the things that came through the report was that young people don't seek advice online, and they don't seek that information online. And I'm not surprised by that at all, because no one knows what to type into Google. Like, you don't know what you don't know. So that was not surprising to me at all. I think one of the other things that we do really well is reach out to young people. So we speak their language, and we do so with things like, with TikToks and things like that. So we know that actually young people don't use Google. They don't look for the news. They look at TikTok. That's where their information is gained from. So that's where we're going to give their information. That's how we will reach them. If that's where they're looking, then that's where we need to tell them how to find this information and give it to them. And we had a very successful TikTok where two of our gang were talking about, in Victoria, apprentices get registration for free. And of course, this was a legal reform that the government couldn't get out to young people because they didn't know how to tell apprentices, hey, you have this benefit. We're encouraging you to do apprentices. And suddenly we had several 100,000 people, because our young people were able to talk to them through TikTok and utilise this government service and this benefit for apprentices. So yeah, those are a couple of things. I'm happy to keep talking. I could talk all day about Young Workers Centre.
The opportunity.
Yeah, sorry, an hour's not long enough.
Kate, likewise, the Young Workers' Rights Service at Youth Law Australia equally seems to be reaching young people and at scale, but clearly a different model. What are you doing there to reach vulnerable young workers at scale?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So I think the major difference is that our Young Workers' Rights Service and YLA is an online legal service. So that means young people can reach out to us by live chat, web form, or phone or email and receive support with their employment law problem. There's a couple of initiatives that we're doing to reach young people that's supported by the research. So one is awareness by doing school-based CLE. So the research found that the young people who were experiencing legal problems were predominantly school leavers. And so going into schools, talking about their basic rights, red flags, and different myths. And the goal of that is not for a young person to understand the legal elements of, say, an unfair dismissal, but it's really just for them to know that there's a service that can help them if they ever experience that issue in the future. Another thing that I think YLA does really well and lots of community legal centres do is just preventing legal problems in the first place through law reform. So there are a lot of things that we can do to help young people identify that they have a legal problem. But if we can stop those issues in the first place, that will stop the young people ever having to go through that distress that they're experiencing. So something that we've recently done this week is we have used our young people's lived experiences and their impacts of their legal problem to inform submissions to essentially ban or restraint of trade clauses in contracts. So YLA and our Young Workers' Rights Service were contacted by young people all over Australia who were really worried about these clauses in their contracts. And so if this reform is successful, it means that none of these young people will actually experience the emotional and financial burden that comes with something like a restraint of trade clause. And I think the last thing that we're doing, which helps, is trying to identify legal problems through health justice partnerships. So YLA has a partnership with a local headspace centre, and there's a couple of things that I think work really well about the partnership. So the first thing is that YLA actually provides community legal education to the clinicians. So we're training them to identify legal need in the clients that are coming to them and teaching them how to use tools like a legal health check. But the second thing that we do is we actually go to the case management meetings with the clinicians, and that gives the clinicians the opportunity to say, hey Kate, I'm working with this client, they've got some problems with their manager, is this something that your legal service can help with? And we say absolutely. And the great thing is that the clinician can then talk to the client in their next appointment and let them know that there's a free service that can help them. But then beyond that, the Headspace clinician reaches out to YLA directly with the young person's consent and connects them to us. So it just takes away that barrier of the young person actually having to access the service. It's facilitated for them. But the final thing I just wanted to touch on with that is that it is a reciprocal relationship. So we heard about the connection between legal problems and stress. So it also means that YLA can then connect that young person with the Headspace Centre to provide that more holistic support.
Look, I just heard some extraordinary strategies there. That prevention can actually, obviously, law reform can actually solve some of these problems before they occur. 70,000 people accessing a benefit that previously had been hard for them to find. Health justice partnerships. It sounds like both your centres are already working in a data-informed way and utilising the evidence base, highly appropriate strategies. I wonder, though, I mean, it's quite clear that the PULS report and the great sea of unmet need out there, 70% of matters having unmet legal need, suggests that we may all have to do more, that something has to change. I'm wondering, Kelly, can you see any potential for change now that you've read the report and the insights gleaned from it for practice at the Young Workers Centre?
Yeah, look, thank you. I think, and I should have said this before, I really want to acknowledge the foundation for actually even cutting the data to reflect what young people are saying, because their voices can be often overlooked. So thank you for actually taking the time and effort to do that. yeah, look, as I read the report, I definitely felt a lot of reinforcement of the experience that we had have at Young Workers Centre. I think, and so that kind of was very comforting because it meant that it's a confirmation of the work that we're doing, and I want to keep doing it. I think there's a few problems at play, and one of the ones that really stuck out at me was that young people tend to ask their employers for help about their employment problem, and that is a big red flag for me because and not to do with ideology or anything like that, but because it is not in an employer's interest to say, here's the overtime rate that you should be paid and here's how you access unfair dismissal laws. And so I really, for me, it's about saying, well, how do we shift who they're talking to? Because that advice is perhaps misinformed or not correct or doesn't cater to the young workers' needs. And so how do we get that independent voice to give them the information that they need? And of course, the doctors is promising, and I think that's fantastic about Headspace. I also big advocate for trade unions because no one knows the workforce better than trade unions. And we need to build up the membership for unions again, because young people are really missing out on information that people of our generation got through trade unions. And I think that's also because there is a big influence on young people from parents and family and friends as well, which again is why we like to have a peer-to-peer approach rather than someone like me talking about legal words that don't make any sense. Hardly ever to me as well. So I think that's really important to kind of get that other voice talking to young people and having them exposed to that other voice, because I'm really concerned that the sources might not be the right place to get advice from. So that's reinforced for me how we, to come back to your question, how we use this data again to say, okay, well, how do we reach these people? And I think one of the things I talked about before was about the TikToks and using that technology to use the algorithm, basically. I'm quite scared of this, but I think we need to embrace it, to use the algorithm to push the information to them, because that's how people will get it. And to go to them, take Muhammad to the mountain, because we young people just don't know what they don't know. And I think the issues that Hugh was raising about the compounding effects is huge. So it's not uncommon for us to have repeat callers because they've done the right thing and raised the issue with their boss, but they've lost their job because they're casual. And so then they have no legal recourse because they're casual. They can't seek a stop the bullying or stop the sexual harassment order. There's no general protections cases for casual workers. You have to work 6 months to get an unfair dismissal. Like, it's just, the solutions aren't there. So I love hearing about the law reform approach, and that's something that we at Young Workers Centre we really drove a lot of the campaign to get apprentice rights recognised in Victoria, because apprentices are treated so appallingly, and especially younger apprentices. Hazing and bullying and harassment is still ongoing and it still happens. So getting the support structures and the systems in place that can actually help those people prevent those problems, or have a source where you can say, this is where you can go. So equally, we're always on the lookout for what the next kind of trend is. And for us at the moment, that's junior rates of pay. So, a 15-year-old who works in the graphic arts industry can lawfully be paid $6.97 an hour, which is, about what it costs to get to work. So, we think that that's our, we're in a cost of living crisis. We see that young people are moving out of home, they're experiencing financial stress. So what's a way that we can fix that? Okay, we're going to go after this age discrimination practice. I think, again, I spoke too long.
Just enough. And all those examples, again, amazing. It's amazing work you're doing. And it's interesting, we have a great many CLCs across Australia and in Victoria working in the employment law space. We have friends and colleagues at JobWatch, at West Justice, of course, Youth Law Victoria, similar name, a different organisation, but great colleagues working in the youth and employment space. And of course, we really value also generalist legal services, generalist CLCs that are often doing employment law. But the practice that we're hearing about here also speaks volumes for specialist centres, or at least specialist programs, still targeting specific issues. Kate, likewise, you're now aware of Georgina and Hugh's new report. Is there anything you can imagine that the YWRS or YLA might do differently to act on that evidence and maybe enhance access to justice for even more young people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I read the research, I thought that there's probably 3 different parts of the client's journey that it can help inform as a legal practitioner. So the first, which Kelly already touched on, is actually reaching the client and making sure they're getting that legal information. So we have a website, we have optimized it for SEO. It is using natural language of young people, but we know that's not enough. And so, as Kelly said, going to where they are, so whether that's Snapchat and TikTok and Twitch, and we've had the same success with we've had the same success with TikTok in that we put out a TikTok about medical disclosures at work, and it very quickly reached over 3,000 young people. And our webpage reached 8,000 people, but I know that the TikTok demographic is most likely to be the young people, and our webpage demographic is probably more likely the advocates who are supporting young people. But I think the second part, and what really struck me, is the barriers that are currently stopping young people from contacting legal services. So I think we need to change what our legal information looks like. So one was that 20% thought that it would make no difference to the outcome. So I think legal services have more to do to actually talk about the potential and positive outcomes that legal services can result in. So for example, our Young Workers' Rights Service has an amazing success rate at conciliation. And last year they recovered over 100,000 in unpaid wages, general damages and superannuation for young people. But that's not actually on our website. So a young person might look up an unfair dismissal, but they might not actually know the potential outcomes of that. So that's one way that I can see that we can reduce that barrier. Another barrier is that young people thought it would be too stressful. And I think, again, making our services much more transparent about what the process actually looks like. So for example, if our Young Workers' Rights Service is representing a young worker at conciliation, they don't have to talk to their employer at all. And I imagine it's the same, they participate in initial phone calls with us and send us some evidence. But then the Young Workers' Rights Service is drafting the application for them. They're speaking on their behalf at conciliation, and it really does take away some of the pressure for that young person. So I think we could do more to share that information rather than just what a legal problem is. And I think the third part of the client journey is noting how many legal problems that a young person experiences and making sure that we're being really holistic in our approach to working with a young person. So making sure that they're not if they finally get to our service, which we know is rare from the research, making sure that they're not walking away from the service with any unmet legal need or any unmet other needs. So for example, asking, you have lost your job, have you been able to get in touch with Centrelink? Are you having any problems with Centrelink? Looking at if it was bullying and harassment, which was really highlighted in the research. Are you feeling safe now? Is there anything else that we need to look at to make sure you're safe? And then making sure that we're making all of the other appropriate referrals to mental health and counselling services as well to support that young person. So I think that's the 3 things that I really took away. And YLA is really well placed to do that as a generalist and specialist service, working together to make sure we're sort of addressing the cluster of legal problems rather than just that presenting problem that the young people come to us with.
That's very interesting. So you mentioned, so the Young Workers' Rights Service, like the Young Workers Centre, is a specialist program. The centre is a specialist centre, but embedded within a generalist service at YLA. Is there, and for both of you, is there, in light of the multiple problems and the fact that the clustering isn't always employment problems, it's apparently also employment and other problems, does it speak to some need for specialist employment law practices and generalist centres to come into some sort of relationship if they're not already?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to firstly identify all of the legal problems, which we could use something like a tool like a legal health check, but then we need to make sure that we are addressing the multitude of problems, and I think we can do that by joining up, making sure we're joining with different services so that we can do that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think the Young Workers Centre definitely has an opportunity to partner better with either generalist legal organisations, but also, with mental health organisations, financial advice, you know, putting money in superannuation accounts is actually really good, and things like that. I 100% agree that there is a role for specialist workplace representatives, but rarely workplace problems present singularly as a workplace problem. Yeah, there's always a multitude of issues, and I think there is an opportunity for the Young Workers Centre to do better at that.
Amazing. I think it sounds like, well, I think that's the injunction, isn't it? It sounds like we all have to do better to reach the, what is it, the 70% of young people with employment law problems who are still experiencing unmet need. Hugh and Georgina, I was wondering, on hearing our practitioners, do you have any thoughts, questions or comments for them?
Was just going to jump in and say everything that's been said is really promising and absolutely great to hear. I'm so glad that you are using those young person social media channels to reach them. I think what you said, Kelly, about hazing and bullying bullying, problems with pay sort of being taken as routine for young people in their first jobs and in casual jobs, and this feeling of, well, everyone else puts up with it, I should. So really making clear that that is not okay in the workplace, and reaching them through those channels is so important. And then what you said, Kate, about general feelings of hopelessness and highlighting stories where you can show actually the same similar young people have been in your position and encountered the same problem, and we've been able to help them and secure good outcomes is so important for hopefully alleviating that sense of cynicism and hopelessness. Yeah.
I think for us, where our research tends to work better is where we put something out and it resonates, it validates, it gives people confidence that, hey, that what I'm seeing is part of a bigger picture. So that's fantastic. Our research works better when it gives people pause for thought and an opportunity to go, okay, well, what do we think is working well, and what do we maybe need to think about doing differently to work in better or new ways. And that's exactly where our interest is pivoting to. We tend to go through some cycles of we identify need and then we try to identify what works to meet that need. So that's exactly what we're really interested in at the moment, around those sort of strategies that look like they're working really well, and then what do we need to do to deliver more of that, and to really make the case for breaking down barriers of justice and delivering justice to people in their lived lives. So yeah, for us, it's very much a synergy. We're not service providers. We have to learn from service providers who are at the front line, and they know best when it comes to tackling some really knotty, spiky issues. But we have a role, and again, when we do it well, to be able to spotlight issues and things that have maybe gone without sufficient spotlight for too long. I'd be pretty confident that, you know, our findings hold over a period of time. So this is not something new. We've just got new tools and techniques for spotlighting an existing problem that's, you know, probably been around since work was invented.
Indeed, Hugh, you were, if I remember correctly, part of the LAW Law Survey, a 2012 survey of the New South Wales Law and Justice Foundation, if I recall. And in that particular survey too, issues of mental distress for young people experiencing legal problems was well identified. I have a feeling, please correct me if I'm wrong, that as a legal profession, we did not work to translate that research into practice as well as we could have across Australia. Does the VLF have plans to persist in events like this, discussions with practitioners? I was fortunate enough to sit at a table with the other night discussing the research with practitioners, a funder and a young worker. And it was transformative for all of us to have that discussion in that way, talking about the research. The VLF's plans for translation work or sharing this research?
Yeah, this is it exactly. So until we get new, it would be great if we had new national data. Because, you know, we're getting questions at the moment from all over the country as, oh, well, what does this mean for my state? We can speculate on some of that a little bit, but we can't answer some of the questions without having new research. Personally, you know, I'm invested in this, and of course I am going to say this, but we do need further and better data. We need further and better research. When you think about the amount of dollars that we spend on research in many other areas, the whole area of civil law is really underspent on. So, you know, that would be one place where sort of this is sort of beyond us, where further work's desperately needed. But in terms of us, yes, we're going to be using our data set, trying to wring all the insights out of it and spending the next 2 to 3 years really promoting that, really sharing that. We're looking to move into and forge stronger and better relationships with community health and welfare services to share our insights and also look at opportunities to work better. And we're looking to scale up and support those sort of interventions and services that work well. There's some, you know, to get into the finances, there are, and we think, a number of opportunities where you invest in legal assistance services, it can be better for society as a whole and save a whole range of costs, a whole range of downstream trauma to the individual, their family, their community. And it's part of the bigger wellbeing question, which we see government becoming more interested in. We think legal assistance has a role to play in contributing to the wellbeing of community.
I will just also add, we have a new research project kicking off at the VLF called Measure for Measure, Tailoring Everyday Justice. So essentially, in the past few months, we've put out the call to CLCs and across the justice sector, asking service providers, courts, all sorts of functions, what do you see to be working in your legal practices? How are you tailoring justice to demographics like young people? And we have had quite a few initiatives submit survey responses for services that tailor their services to young people and address the problems that young people are facing. So we're hoping that report kind of will dig deeper into sort of discussing what is seen to be working. The PULS survey found all this unmet legal need. What are we doing to address that need, and what is seen to be working in the sector? So that will be great to share later this year.
Thank you, Georgina. Look, we'll shortly move into questions. And I think we have questions in the chat and perhaps some in the room today. But I just thought I'd quickly just reflect. The discussion, of course, has been self-explanatory. I don't propose to rehash it. It sounds like we have great innovations happening currently and planned. It sounds like people are engaging with the evidence base, but there's clearly a need for ongoing translation work and knowledge sharing. And I think that these discussions and getting different cohorts into the room is going to be so important for that work, and that the legal profession as a whole needs to get behind it. But Hugh, you mentioned the word well-being, and we talk about legal problems or justiciable problems, as the report talks about. But before a lawyer looks at these, they're just problems, and they're problems causing stress. An employment law problem is an employment problem before it's a legal problem, and the stress that it causes is a health problem. We really need people to understand that, and I think this is what you're saying, that working to solve legal problems is actually working to solve social problems. And if we solve those social problems, which tend to cluster and cause poverty, homelessness, mental ill health, then we're going to achieve a great public good. And perhaps along the way, us lawyers have mismessaged this. You know, we've been selling this message about legal problems, and it sort of looks like we're creating business for ourselves as lawyers, but we're not. What we really maybe need to be talking about is that these are just problems. We can apply a legal lens to them, and we have a certain set of tools that can often solve them and ameliorate them. But what we're really doing is solving social problems. And I hope that we can maybe re-message this in time to come. But I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Emily, who I think you've got a number of questions in the chat and from the floor.
Matt and panel, we do have some questions. I might just move on in here. So the first question is for Kate, and it is in regards to the Headspace collaboration. So question is if YLA and its collaboration with Headspace being documented and evaluated, because it sounds like a great innovative model of practice. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. It hasn't. So it's a pilot that we have with a local Sydney Headspace. I think we would love to expand it and evaluate it properly. We've been running it for about just over 2 years now. And I know that we've had over 50 young people come through us through that service. So it's something that we would love to expand on and explore health justice partnerships more broadly as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have another question, and I may direct this to Kelly and Kate. So someone has shared that they think young people are also inspired by the success stories of others who have access organizations to help. So that would be other young people and their advocates. So do you think that you do enough to share positive outcomes? And have you got any examples, such as a campaign to highlight and learn?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. No, I don't think we do enough to share our wins. We absolutely don't. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One is often confidentiality attached to settlement agreements. We do our very best to avoid having confidentiality in any settlement agreements because part of the community problem that we're solving is diminished if people can't talk about it. I also think that there is a real opportunity in sharing that story because I do think, and this is related to the confidence issue, it's very sad to me that people don't feel confident coming forward and raising their issues and that they find it easier to kind of walk away, which, you know, I'm on the front line, I completely accept, but it does mean that problems perpetuate and they don't get solved, and that employer can continue or that person can continue bullying and harassing someone. So unless we have, you know, a collectivist approach, our individualist society has kind of rewarded that, well, it's too hard for me, so I'm going to walk away, but then it's still a problem for the next person. So I think that kind of sharing those wins and saying, here's a person who has stood up and succeeded in doing so, can definitely reinforce that story. So I think that's a great tip that I'll take away.
Yeah, I should just add that it maybe will help the legal system appear less alien and less accessible to young people.
Yeah.
Agree.
Kate, did you have anything like that?
Just I completely agree. I think YLA has an opportunity to share the positive outcomes just on our website, on social media. And as you said, it just takes away some of the unknown and just, well, what's the point? What are they actually going to do for me? To say this is a young person who was in a very, very similar situation to you and managed to get those unpaid wages or whatever it may be. So I think it's something that we can do.
Absolutely agree. And so we've just got another question, and this one is directed at you and Georgina. So it is about scaling up the public understanding of the law survey, which is obviously been done in Victoria. And what are some of those tools that you might need to scale up, and how long might that take, and what would that look like?
You're the person to speak on this one.
We've got the tools, we've got the technology, we can do it, we can action it. We just need the support. As you can imagine, going to, say in Victoria, 6,000 people and interviewing them in their house. This is a face-to-face survey. This is sort of world best practice. There's a whole range of reasons for it. It's almost impossible to engage with people on any length of time around some serious issues on the telephone anymore. People don't accept calls from an unknown number, and so developing all of that is difficult. Australia is a big country. It's got a lot of challenges to doing national surveys, but we have the technology, we have the ability to do it. It's just resource intensive. If I'm being cynical, there are some elements which maybe don't want to have to face these problems because they're difficult to solve. So, that's another reason why we've had to struggle for a long time to do follow-up research to the Legal Australia-wide survey. I can say that national surveys have been floated numerous times since. For one reason or another, they just haven't got off the ground and haven't been successful. And, at the very least, I think we need a periodic stock take to understand what's happening in our justice system. And I think that's benefits everybody.
Yes, certainly. And Georgina, to add?
No, you summed it up well. It's very resource intensive, for
That's
sure.
true, yes. And I'll just turn to our in-person attendees. If there's any questions from the audience, we're more than happy to take them. Thank you.
And thanks, Kelly. This is probably one for you, just picking up on something that you mentioned about often young people are turning straight to their employers when they have an issue. Do you think there is a role for employers to play at all in being the distributor of information or being obligated potentially to point employees in the direction of independent services?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really great question. And when the Fair Work Act came in and the National Employment Standards in 2009 required the Fair Work Information Statement to be distributed, I was absolutely thrilled with that as a reform. And I know that it's been replicated with like casual rights and things like that. But I don't think it's been effective. And look, it's one of, when we go to court and we're arguing a contravention, we always add in a contravention for failure to provide the information statement because it's never provided. But I'm yet to see any actual impact of not providing that information statement. And I'm also yet to see any impact of people actually reading it. The role of employers, I think, is important, especially in the apprenticeship space, because apprentices are bonded to their employers and they look up to them. And so they are a real source of trust. They're a trusted source. And I don't know. I don't know how to solve that problem. I know that policies and procedures and endless reams of paper and saying these policies apply to you, but they don't apply to us, isn't helpful in meeting that need. But there's got to be a better way. You're quite right. I don't know how to educate employers about that, but yeah, there's got to be a better way. Yeah, that isn't just legal cases and, you know, having number of disputes is like KPIs and things like that just don't, yeah, I don't think they work, but there is definitely work to be done there.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks for the question. I'll just check. We probably have time for one more question if there's any.
So as a lawyer myself, I've found that statistic regarding young people having higher trust in lawyers than other age groups quite interesting. And especially comparing it to one of the reasons that they don't seek legal help for their issues being that they don't think anything's going to change or that they're going to get an outcome. So I guess with what was surveyed in terms of trust, was it asking them whether they trust a lawyer's skills generally and their technical expertise, or that they'd be able to help in a situation affecting a young person?
It wasn't specifically about a young person. Survey respondents were asked about their attitudes and trust in lawyers across a number of dimensions. So whether they would trust them to act in their best interests, whether they would trust or expect them to even break the rules, to go beyond for them. Generally speaking, we have a lot of law-abiding people who expect lawyers to do, you know, that meet their professional obligations. So yes, generally, yes, some specific elements, not some specific elements about young people in particular. But that's a fantastic question. And that's an area where we would probably need to do some different types of research. So some more qualitative research about people who might have had experiences, particularly with young people who might have had experience with lawyers.
I will also just add it was a question that was more abstract, and we don't know for sure, but I do assume that some young people had higher trust because they had never encountered a lawyer or had to go to a lawyer, and maybe that's one reason why trust maybe that's one reason why trust decreases with age. Maybe it's because of experience and increased cynicism. But when it did come to their specific problems, we did see that they didn't think the law was relevant, and those levels of cynicism and hopelessness increased. So,
well, thank you so much, Georgina. On that very promising note, and I know that that's the only lawyer joke for the day, so we've done actually very, very well. Could you please put your hands together, everyone, and remotely for our panelists, Hugh, Georgina, Kate, and Kelly. And I do apologise for going briefly over, but I'd also like to extend my thanks to the Victoria Law Foundation, in particular Nikita, Vicky and Fabiola, and for Victoria Law Week, of course. I'd like to thank you, our audience online and here today. And for those of you here today, please do enjoy the catering before you go back to your office. The event has been recorded, and we'll be sending that out to you after we've done some post-production, including with contact details for our panelists. So if you have any further questions and want to engage or indeed share knowledge, you can. And with that said, I'd like to thank you all and wish you goodbye. Thanks so much.